In learning about data files and statistical analysis, we'll use a process similar to what we've done with other topics. We'll walk you through all the steps for an example based on one survey. You'll practice with information from a different survey and check your work. Then you'll complete the process a third time on your own. If you haven't already looked at the guides, you might do that after you watch this video. They'll help refresh your memory as you practice and work on your own. This is a good time to note, too, that the data we'll use for the examples and activities is only for the purpose of learning about these processes. It isn't a legitimate research data file. Now, on to the featured attraction. As I mentioned earlier, if we have data on paper, we need to enter that data. In those cases, we can create our data file in SPSS and save a step later. I'll include the resources about that in the class materials. Sometimes it's more practical to start in Excel, though. For example, if we used a Google form to administer a survey, we can download the data into Excel. We just open the file in a Google Drive, go to the File menu, select Download As, and select Excel. It'll open the data file in Excel. It'll look like the worksheet in this slide. You might have already noticed that this file looks a little overwhelming and doesn't seem like something we could analyze with statistics. That's a good call, and part of the reason we need to work with it. We will eventually move the data into SPSS to conduct analysis, so we'll need to keep some things in mind to make our lives easier at that point. SPSS calls each question in the data set a variable, and the responses to each question are data. The Google form identifies each question, or each variable, by putting the full question in the first row of the column and the data in the following rows. SPSS won't be able to work with having the full question in the first row. It doesn't work with spaces, among other things. Having that much information also makes it complicated for us, so the first thing we do is change the first row. The easiest way to identify the variable is to include an abbreviation for the name of the measure and the question number, no spaces. In the example in the slide, you can see I started by changing the top row to SGS1, SGS2, and so forth. I did that because this example uses the short grit scale, so for other data sets you would use the abbreviation that makes sense for the surveys based on that data. That said, we may also have demographic variables in the data set, and they will need to have new labels for SPSS too. When we work with statistics, we usually treat scale scores as interval data. In other words, instead of treating the words in the responses as simply categories, we assign numbers so we can compute the mean and the standard deviation. When we have information about the response options for a survey, we usually also have the information about the numbers that are assigned to those response options. For example, when Duckworth, Peterson, Matthews, and Kelly developed the original, slightly longer version of the short grit scale I'm using in the example, they labeled the responses 1 through 5, as I've noted in the slide. So we'll do the same thing. In Excel, we can do that by holding down the Control button and hitting the F key to access the Find dialog. Then we select the tab that says Replace. From there, we put the wording for the response option in the top box and the number in the lower box. Then we click Replace All. If you copy and paste the options, make sure to delete any extra spaces at the end. The search feature is sensitive enough, it will say it can't find the phrase because it doesn't have those spaces at the end. Excel will go through and change all of the fields, and you'll see a notification that it's done. We'll need to repeat that step for each of the 5 response options. Note that the Replace All function is literally just looking for the characters you tell it to find. So you want to be careful about what order you go in to replace the response options. Sometimes you need to go out of sequence altogether. For example, if you had the scale in this slide and went in order, before we move on, we also want to make sure all of our data is valid. It's a good time to note we don't need to throw out responses from a participant if he or she did not answer every question. SPSS adjusts analysis as necessary, so we can use the data that is available without messing up results because of the missing data. For example, in our data file for the short grit scale, you might notice that row 16 is missing a response for question 4. It's not a problem. Remember, though, that participants might respond in a way that does not represent a valid measure. It might be all negative, or all positive, or all in the middle. Some scales use reverse scored items to detect that. In other words, they include questions that should have a different response than the others. In this case, we can still eyeball the data, note if there are any rows that contain the same responses for every question. If there are, we'll delete the row from the data set. In our data file for the short grit scale, row 6 is an example of this. Participant answered 5 to all of the questions. In some cases, Excel can compute what we need for analysis from here. It's limited though, and the SPSS program can actually be easier once we get used to it.